Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It's 4 o'clock, and you're here with us. Thank you for coming out to support our talk and to support conversations on the Arctic. We have a panel of experts here, which you'll hear from very shortly. But first, I want to draw your attention to the slide, right? It's red. It's the Arctic. How many people have seen the Arctic in red before? I have to thank my panelists for giving me some creativity, kind of freedom here to play with it because, we always see the Arctic as this like, oh, it's pristine, it's blue, it's white, it's beautiful. And, it is, but if we don't do something, it's not going to be like that for very long. So I thought I would do a little play on colors. But on a more serious note, no, seriously, how many people here watch Netflix? Hands up. Great. Keep your hand up if you have watched The Diplomat. Okay. Season 2? Okay. Remember that scene about the Arctic? We're going to talk about that because everyone's talking about Greenland. So anyways, thought I might link it back to some pop culture to make it a little bit easier. But welcome, everyone. Really glad to be having this conversation. My name is Michelle Lee. I am the founder of Clever Carbon, also the co-founder of Women in Climate. I didn't know that I actually have been to the Arctic until I had a conversation with Kishla yesterday. And I was like, wait, I've been to Tromsø to see the Northern Lights. And I Googled it, and I have been to the Arctic before. But with that note, I'm going to pass it on to our esteemed speakers for some introductions, starting with Sherri.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm Sherri Goodman, and I am the author of this book, which we'll talk a little bit about, Threat Multiplier, Climate Military Leadership and the Fight for Global Security. It's my story and the story of other military leaders on the front lines of a changing climate. I served for many years in the U.S. Department of Defense. During and after the Cold War, from the Hunt for Red October to The Diplomat. So we're going to take you through all of that, and now I lead the International Military Council on Climate and Security, which is a group of national security and military leaders focused on the national security implications of a changing climate. I'm also affiliated with the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., and happy to be with you all today.
Thank you. Sally. Yeah, please, a round of applause for Sherri.
Good to see everyone. Thank you for coming out this afternoon. My name is Sally Ann Ranney, and I'm president of Global Choices. Global Choices is an international, all-women-led organization that is focused on the Arctic and climate change because the Arctic has become the epicenter of climate change. And we are proposing a moratorium on the Central Arctic Ocean to protect it from a variety of threats, which is where a lot of the sea ice, which is retreating into that area. And we need to protect it as long as we can. My background is in conservation for 52 years. I was a resource policy analyst for the Wilderness Society, also on the board of the National Wildlife Federation and the Climate Accountability Institute.
Thank you, Sally. And Kishla.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kishla Askins. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Polar Pangaea, and we're a consultancy that develops global solutions for Arctic challenges. I'm also a commissioner on the City of Alexandria, Virginia Environmental Policy Commission. And prior to that, I spent 30 years in uniform in the Navy, serving at all corners of our world in support and in service to our nation and the Constitution. Most recently, I spent some time in the Department of Veteran Affairs as a Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Department of Enterprise Integration, where we leveraged policy, governance, and data to create efficiencies and streamline operations.
Hand of applause, please. As you can see, we truly have some experts in the room today. So as we're going through the panel, please think of your questions. It's unlikely that you're going to run into an Arctic expert anytime soon. So any questions that you may have, we'll have a microphone here afterwards. And also, if you want to take a quick photo of this, if you feel inspired to tweet something or share something to social media, Instagram, etc., I think it's really helpful to get the word out on the Arctic. So as much as you're comfortable, the handles are there. I'll just keep it up here for a moment in case a couple of folks want to take a photo there. All right. So as you saw, Sherri has her book. She also has a book signing tomorrow. What time is it? 11 a.m.
11 a.m.
Perfect.
Love to see you there.
Yes. And we're going to start right into the meat of the question. So Sherri, my first question to you, what is national security and what does the Arctic have to do with it?
Okay, great. And thank you, Michelle, very much for bringing us all together, and thank you, all of you, for being here. So when you look at this map, and we want to talk about national security in the Arctic, first of all, national security is about, first and foremost, protecting our homeland. And when you look at this map, it's very clear that we are an Arctic nation, right? We have Alaska. In addition, it's also, national security is also about protecting other threats to America's national interest. Now, during the Cold War, think Hunt for Red October, we've long had our key military assets are nuclear submarines, US and Soviet, now Russian submarines, patrolling the Arctic. They are the most secure leg of our nuclear triad. So we have land-based, air-based, and sea-based nuclear forces. That is the deterrent that protects us from annihilation. And for many years now, the Arctic has been a key area of patrol. We also have primary assets, we have land-based and missile assets, satellites. In many ways, the Arctic is the approach to the American homeland from either Russian, North Korean, or Chinese, or even Iranian today, nuclear forces that can travel over the poles. So if you see from that map up there, you can see that Alaska is in many ways the 2, and Greenland is the 10 of the North American continent. Now, for years, should we go to the next slide? For years, at the end of the Cold War, we were working cooperatively with the Russians to manage changes in the Arctic and to reduce nuclear waste streams and remove nuclear weapons from places like Ukraine and other parts of the Russian Arctic. We've gone from an era of cooperation to rising tensions. And in my book, I tell the story here of Admiral Fogo, pictured on this slide. Admiral Fogo is a 4-star Navy admiral who, as a young submariner in the 1980s, went up to the Arctic and did this ice pick maneuver that's shown there with the nuclear submarine popping up through the ice. And it was very common at that time when the submarine pops up, maybe near the North Pole. The sailors can get out and play a little baseball, put on a Santa cap, take some pictures, and send it back home to the families because, of course, they're cloistered in the submarine for months at a time. Well, then Admiral Fogo goes back up about 20 years later. When he first went, he was a young submariner, and then he goes back. Now he's in command of the submarine, and he tries to go back to about the same spot, but there's not enough ice. And when he surfaces, he can't do that maneuver. He finds blue water and even plastic waste. So that's an example of how the Arctic has changed just in our lifetime. We really have a new ocean that's open. And on the map, you can see the sea routes, the sea routes across the Arctic. The one in blue is the northern sea route that hugs Russia's shallow coastline. Russia has the largest geography across in the Arctic. It's the largest Arctic nation. It's got cities, it's got energy, industrial capability, and under President Putin, He envisions the Northern Sea Route as a toll road for transportation from ports in Asia to ports in Europe. And he has set aggressive goals for Rosatom, his shipping company, to bring more ships through the Arctic. Even non-ice-clad vessels have transited the Arctic in recent summers. Meanwhile, China eyes this route as a polar Silk Road. So if we go to the next slide, we can see that China has an ambitious own Arctic strategy. It's declared itself a near-Arctic stakeholder since 2018 and is cooperating with Russia, investing in energy extraction, in shipping, learning how to operate in the Arctic, and has aspirations not only to use that Northern Sea Route, but in the future, potentially a Central Arctic route where it will not be subject to Russian tolls and will have access not only to energy, but in decades hence, maybe even to fish. So these are among the resources available in the Arctic. Meanwhile, this area has become more militarized. Russia has added many more military bases since the end of the Cold War and is seeking to ensure that it has access to the resources it wants to preserve.
Thank you. This is a little National Security 101 plus Arctic in 5 minutes. Thank you, Sherri, for taking us through that. So, we're in a climate track, and the next really natural question, I'm going to pass this over to Sally, is what is the relationship between the Arctic and climate?
We all know that CO2 emissions are rising and continue to rise despite what the UN climate conferences have tried to put a limit, have nations have a voluntary, if you will, a voluntary limit on what they will try to reduce. But we have gone from 412 ppms per million of CO2 to 224, balancing out at 220. It continues to rise. As it rises, this is what the temperature projections are for the Arctic to 2100. This is if we stay on the trajectory that we are on now, which is 2.7 degrees Celsius instead of 1.5 degrees Celsius. So this is what's happened to the ice. 1979, NASA started satellite tracking what the Arctic sea ice was doing. Right now, the Arctic is warming 4 times, and in some places 7 times faster than anywhere else on Earth. And yet it's a planetary cooling system, it's a climate stabilizer, and it's actually a shield. Why it's so important, it is a heat shield. It's a shield which reflects the sun's heat and radiation, keeping temperatures stabilized on the planet. And we've lost 15 to 25% of that reflection, and 50 to 95, depending percent of the heat from the sun is reflected, depending on what study you're looking at. So this shield, which is critical to our entire planet, has been seriously injured by emissions. And so this is where it was in 2023, but in February of this year, even less ice extent. The light blue is very thin ice, which doesn't reflect as well as thick ice. We've lost about 90% of the thick ice. So it has been an early warning system. Scientists have been raising the alarm for decades, but nobody has been listening until, we hope, recently. So what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic, and that's why it's happening in the streets, in America, in the Arctic, in the Amazon, in Africa, in Europe. It's affecting systems everywhere, and it's a trigger for those tipping points that you saw. So why does this matter? because everything is connected to everything. We have 5 systems on the planet, life support systems. They're all interrelated, interdependent. If one, like the cryosphere, which is the ice and snow on the planet, the glaciers, the polar caps, etc., if that one starts disintegrating, it affects all of the others. And you can see on the bottom that it disrupts food chains, oxygen production, circulation, the ocean conveyor belt, if you will, the AMOC, the Gulf Stream, and more severe changes in the atmosphere. And so this is because we live in a whole systems situation on the planet. We're whole systems dependent. So one of the things that has happened is it has changed, it has significantly contributed to changes in the jet stream. So when you have a down oscillation, you have Texas freeze. When you have an up oscillation, you have a heat dome. All the heat from the equator comes up, stops with the cold air, holds for a while. You have droughts, wildfires, and then so much moisture collects, boom, you have floods. Sea level rise. Everybody's heard about sea level rise. If the Greenland ice sheet goes, it's 24 feet. And this is what it looks like on the coast of America and Florida. So really what happens in Greenland is the future of Miami. These are the fires in LA. That's a flood on the right, upper right, that's a flood in Italy. The bottom are and there are even more tornadoes there. That was in Kansas. And one of the most renowned ice scientists has said that we are all ice-dependent species. So regionally, what's happening? It's affecting the food chain. Everything is dependent upon the Arctic cod, and the Arctic cod is dependent upon zooplankton, which is dependent upon phytoplankton. So everything is connected to everything, and as you lose the ice, the Arctic cod, their whole life cycle, depends on the ice. It's one of the largest fisheries on the planet. We've already lost maybe 17% because the ice is melting. So interestingly enough, for global leaders, the Arctic is a measurable metric to which we could calibrate, we could correlate what are the absolute necessary deep emission cuts we need now. Because this system of the 5 Earth systems is going the fastest. So what we did, that's for the next conversation. Yeah. Okay. So thank you.
Thank you for taking us through that. That was a crash course on the Arctic and the relationship with climate, but we can see that there are so many implications from national security topics that Sherri talked about to what Sally has referenced, and also health. And that's where, Kishla, I'm going to come to you. What is the relationship between the Arctic and health?
Yeah, thank you. So my current research is on the biosecurity risks of thawing permafrost in a warming Arctic. So what is permafrost? That's frozen ground. We find it on land and actually deep in the sea, the Arctic Ocean. And so what I'm looking at specifically is, are there emerging, re-emerging, or novel pathogens in the permafrost that could cause exposures, endemic, pandemic? And so that is just one. There are, we know, smallpox, influenza, tularemia, plague, among other organisms that exist within that permafrost. And so we do have vaccinations, and that's usually the response I get. These are organisms that have been locked for millennia. And so they could be genetically different than what exists today, which then poses challenges to our current vaccination. Secondly, I spent 30 years as a clinician focused on emergency medicine, wilderness medicine, and disaster medicine. So I'm always looking for the zebra in the room and in our patients to ensure that we don't miss anything. Thinking about climate effects in the Arctic and the wildfires that we are seeing more severe, more frequent. I think even in the United States, the wildfires in Alaska, in Canada, we could experience that down in the Midwest of the United States. And so we talk about respiratory, people who have asthma or reactive airway disease. How will these environmental changes, which I say the Arctic is ground zero, where it all starts and is controlled and is our thermostat, how will that affect everyday disease processes? And then last but certainly not least, we have to talk about the interconnection of plant, animal, and human health. And so there's a program, One Health, that actually is looking at that. We look at SARS, we look at COVID, pandemic, and we know that it all started within an animal. But we know that organisms jump hosts, which then pose challenges to humans.
Thank you, Kishla. So, I think if there's one thing so far is that what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic. And I will also say that, we have to talk about it. Right now, we're talking a lot about greenhouse gas emissions. I talk a lot about carbon, but we're not talking about the Arctic enough. So again, I encourage everyone to maybe have a few key takeaways that they can bring up during Thanksgiving.
Or Easter or Passover.
Yes, or Easter or Passover. Now, my next question is, we are hearing, in the news, there are some mentions of the Arctic. There's a lot of geopolitical activity going on right now. So what is unfolding and what are the risks? Sherri?
Well, as Sally said, the Arctic is warming 4 times the global average. So we have a whole new ocean opened in our lifetime. And so the resources of the Arctic are creating competition for those resources. Russia seeks to monetize it. China has a polar Silk Road, and the U.S. now. We've been an Arctic nation for a long time, and now we are even looking at, Greenland in a new light. The new administration is talking about, we have to have it. What do we have to have? We've long had a military base in the northwest of Greenland. It was called Thule. Now it's called Patuxent Air Force Base. It's our eyes in the sky in the Arctic on the eastern side, and then of course we have Alaska on our western side. We have the geopolitics of the world have shifted dramatically since the election. And that will also shift what's happening in the Arctic from one where the long game was about cooperation, peace, and stability, to one now that seems to be much more about spheres of influence. I'll control this part, you control that part. And so when you look at the map of the Arctic, I think you have to see how that could evolve, while at the same time recognizing that there's still a lot of global trade.
Sally or Kishla, would you like to add to what's happening and unfolding right now? Kishla, go ahead.
So I think, I want to make a reference to Game of Thrones. How many people saw Game of Thrones? Okay, so I think when we talk about geopolitics and what's happening in the Arctic, remember, Jon Snow would sit on top of the wall and make sure that nothing evil or bad came to the north. And then, we would always hear winter is coming, and that's the call to climate change, that it's here. The big glacier wall would serve as, the permafrost And we saw by the end of Game of Thrones that it was disintegrating. And then finally, if you remember the three families in the Game of Thrones getting to the geopolitics, right? Each of those families wanted to do what? Control the North. And the North is the Arctic.
Love our little callbacks to pop culture here. And I guess, what's unfolding right now also brings us to the question of Greenland. There's a lot going on in Greenland right now. What's happening? Why do people care about Greenland all of a sudden?
Well, let me say first, I had the privilege of visiting Greenland this last summer. So it is a beautiful place. You can see climate change happening right. You could hear it, see it as the ice is cracking and melting and the ice sheet is retreating. And yes, if the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets both melt, they could raise global sea levels by several feet before the end of the century and change the entire east coast of the United States from Maine down to Miami and well beyond. So there are some very serious decadal implications. There are some near-term economic and other implications of what's happening. The first nonstop flights from the United States to Greenland from New York to Nuuk will start just in a few months. So one could see a future in Greenland that could be some version of the transformation that's occurred in Iceland over the last several decades. I mean, when I was growing up, people didn't go on vacation to Iceland. But now, everybody wants to go to Iceland all year round just to go for a few days because it's a short flight from the east coast of the United States, and they've developed a very tourist-friendly industry. Now, Greenland geographically is very different. Iceland is volcanic. Greenland is an ice sheet. There are only 57,000 people there. I was in the third largest town, Ilulissat, and that has 5,000 people in it. So, and the road network is only about 20 miles in the whole island. So most of the travel is done either by air or by boat. So there are two airports that are expanding, so there will be more travel there and potentially more tourism, but there will be potentially some limits to how rapidly that can develop. And at the same time, there are minerals. There's been a lot of talk. Now we're talking about a Ukraine minerals deal. President Trump has also talked about mineral deals in Greenland. Meanwhile, Greenlanders who have an important election coming up later this week are going to be talking about their own future. Of course, they're part of Denmark now, and they've been self-governing since 1979, and that they still get grants from Denmark to provide for their defense and their security, and also for the expansion of these two new airports and other parts of their infrastructure. And so Greenlanders they say, we're open for business, but we're not open for sale.
Also, Sherri, you mentioned that Greenland is going to take the Arctic chair soon. So,
yes, so there is an Arctic Council that since 1995 has been an international group of the 8 Arctic coastal states with dozens of observers from India to China, as well as the indigenous people. So it's not a military body like NATO. It's a non-security organization that deals with issues like education, environment, health, but it has provided a great deal of confidence building until Russia's invasion of Ukraine, when inclusion of Russia in the Arctic Council forums was paused. So, and the chair rotates every 2 years, and it's about to rotate to Denmark, which means Greenland will have a very important role in its future.
Sally, any remarks you want to add about Greenland, or we're good?
Well, I think that considering that climate security for the planet is basically on thin ice now, the fact that the Trump administration is not taking sea level rise seriously, and the Arctic, right now, the Greenland ice sheet is losing 30 million tons of ice per hour. all of that fresh water, cold water, goes into the ocean, and that ultimately affects ocean circulation. Given the fact that this is such an important system, we should actually be asking that question, because about sea level rise, it'll be 24 feet if the whole of, estimated, if the whole of the Iceland ice sheet melts. And you saw that map. I mean, Miami is gone, a lot of the East Coast is gone, Manhattan is almost underwater, and that is not that far off. We're talking probably not 2100 anymore, we're talking sooner, because now they're estimating, at one time they said the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, which informs the UN on climate, said in one of their reports that they didn't think that the Arctic Ocean would be ice-free until 2100. That has been changed now to maybe 2035, maybe 2040. And that relates to also how much faster the Arctic, or the Greenland ice sheet will melt.
Maybe I should add here, and I should have said earlier that, you know, the title of my book is Threat Multiplier, which is a term I coined in 2007 when I organized the first group of generals and admirals to assess the national security implications of climate change. And we spent a year with the nation's leading climate scientists and others to understand the security implications of climate change. And at the end of that year of study, and with analysts at the Center for Naval Analysis, which is a federally funded research and development center like RAND, we determined that climate change would act as a threat multiplier, leading to instability in volatile regions of the world, but would also act to destabilize other parts of the world. And what Sally and others, what we've been describing is really that threat multiplier of climate change in the Arctic.
Yes, and we were going to quickly talk about The Diplomat in Season 2, but if anyone does have a question, you can line up here on the microphone afterwards, but this was a really good scene.
It's a great scene.
It's a great scene. Okay, so what is the worst case scenario realistically, right? Like realistically, like not, you know, north of the wall, but like actually realistically of what can unfold over the next few years, Sherri?
Well, let me just put this in context, because when you think of the threats and you think about the security, you always think about what time frames. So Sally has very accurately characterized, you know, the longer-term threat of sea level rise from the Arctic and Antarctica that will affect us all. That is a long-term threat. This graph is what I call what keeps me up at night in the near-term risks in a more open Arctic, which is that we're going to have more ships operating in the region. Russia has many nuclear icebreakers, floating nuclear power plants. It's really nuclearized and militarized. It's part of the Arctic. What keeps me up at night is a scenario where you have a Russian nuclear icebreaker escorting a Chinese liquid natural gas vessel through the narrow Bering Straits, where Alaska and Russia are at most 30 miles apart, and there's an accident. And what happens? We are in international waters. We may not know the condition of the ships or the people aboard those ships. You have a search and rescue, maybe an oil spill, maybe a radiological spill. And if you think back to the Exxon Valdez oil spill, which wasn't even in the Arctic, it was in Alaska, but not Arctic Alaska, there's a lot we do not know and understand about how to clean up a major spill in the Arctic. And that's just one example. Now you have many big tourist ships plying the Arctic as well. So those are the near-term risks of an incident that requires a search and rescue and could have long-term ecological damage.
Sally, talk to us a little bit about some of the extreme weather that's going to happen and realistically unfold.
Well, I just wanted to respond to Sherri in that there's also short-term risk, if you will, in extreme weather. In the United States, we estimate right now probably $438 billion in costs. Helene, Milton, the LA fires, and there's a lot more that doesn't get press, but these events, they're not even events anymore, they're episodes, are definitely happening, and they're taking lives and livelihoods. As far as the multiplier of threats that you were talking about, we're not going to go to my slide yet, but the reason I talk about the Central Arctic Ocean is because, and it's also known as the heart of the Arctic. It's right in the middle of the Arctic Ocean, and it belongs to no one and everyone. It is actually a global commons under the UN law of the sea. It's for the benefit of all. It has ecosystem services, as you saw, that benefit the entire planet. And so on the short-term threats or results of letting the ice go, which is what we have done, basically, global leaders have not made it a priority. It is not at the top of the global agenda, and it should be. That decision is leading to all of the short-term threats that are going to multiply. The weather's going to get more extreme. The long-term threats that you mentioned, being that if we lose all the ice by 2100, or even sooner, what does that look like? Well, an estimated 2 billion climate refugees from the coasts. And that's going to create more conflict. Changes in where food can be produced, because weather patterns are going to change and not going to have the precipitation or the availability to produce food in areas that we completely rely on now. So there's something called the precautionary principle in science. And we should actually be looking at the Arctic from that lens, from a whole systems lens, and from a precautionary principle. Do not allow these threats of shipping across the North Pole, just for the reasons that Sherri was saying. Deep seabed mining in the southern part of the Arctic Ocean. There are nodules there, and they just recently found out that the nodules actually create oxygen, which is interesting. Also, there cannot be unregulated mass tourism. There cannot be unregulated geoengineering. Doesn't mean that maybe that'll happen at some point, but it cannot be unregulated. And these are threats going for the resources, oil and gas exploitation, and nuclear waste dumping also. So this is a vast area that really needs to be protected for a multiple of reasons.
Yeah. So realistically, it could be bad. And in case geoengineering, what does that even mean in the Arctic? There are companies, scientists out there that are trying to refreeze the Arctic. That was something that I learned about a couple years ago, and part of my journey becoming an Arctic advocate, that we're in such a big mess that they're trying to refreeze the Arctic. And how do you even do that, right? You go to a snowboarding indoor thing, and you've got some snow there, but to do that in such a big region, that's going to be tough. So maybe turning on a little bit more of a positive note, and I'm going to have Kishla lead us here. What is the best case scenario of what can unfold from this point on that is realistic, and maybe what are some of the levers and tools as well? But what is the best case scenario?
So I'll just add to piggyback on to what they said. The worst case scenario for me is that a novel pathogen becomes unlocked and a state or non-state actor weaponizes it as a bioterrorist weapon. The best case scenario is that we cooperate, we plan, and prepare for a crisis, because it's not a matter if a crisis will occur, as Sherri brought about the sea vessels and the increased globalization of the Arctic. But I'll also add the globalization brings things into the Arctic and takes things out of the Arctic. Again, does not stay in the Arctic. So the best case scenario that we can use, and do you have my next slide? Yeah, so what we can do is, these are elements of power: diplomacy, information intelligence, military or economic levers. I would like to add an additional science as an element of power, both through the science lens of research and development, and tech as an augment to facilitating that surveillance and monitoring. We talk about disaster. Here in the United States, we use drones quite a bit for disaster assessments. There's a role potentially for drones in understanding what is going on, monitoring tech to ensure that we understand the air and water quality as the permafrost thaws, understanding what exactly is thawing into the water sources and the food sources, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later.
Can I just illustrate Kishla's point? I love that you added the S, the dimes, to science diplomacy. Is a vastly underrated component of our foreign policy and our national security. And I personally had my own first experience in the Arctic occurred in the 1990s when I was serving as the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security, essentially the Pentagon's chief environmental officer. And one day the Secretary of Defense walked down to my office, which he didn't usually do because I go to the boss's office. But he said to me, "Sherri, I just met with the Norwegian Minister of Defense, and he says that the most important thing we can do in U.S.-Norwegian defense relations is engage the Russians about the leaking of their sunken nuclear submarines in the Kola Peninsula in the northwest part of Russia, because the Norwegians are concerned that that will contaminate their fishing grounds with leaking radioactive and hazardous waste." And then he said, "Over to you, Sherri, now figure it out." So from there, we built something called the Arctic Military Environmental Cooperation Program. Arctic Military Environmental Cooperation Program, which ran for over a decade. We helped the Russians build a cask to safely offload these liquid waste streams from the decommissioned and sunken nuclear submarines, about 100 of them, so they could be shipped inland for safer storage. And it was a model of both soft power diplomacy, but also engagement on science, technology, engineering, and understanding a changing environment.
I think one of the things that stood out to me as we were preparing and I was hearing from these experts is that the Arctic for the longest time has been a place of cooperation and peace. And that's potentially why we didn't even hear much about it, but it seems to me that that is about to change. And I know, Sally, you have some tools that you want to talk about as well for a best case scenario.
So we have
Sally.
my organization and a variety of partners have proposed a 10-year moratorium on the Central Arctic Ocean, and what it would put a pause on, a precautionary pause, is oil and gas. I already said this. Deep seabed mining, radioactive waste dumping, commercial transport that Sherri brought up, what all the risks are of that across the North Pole, weapon testing, and unregulated mass tourism and geoengineering. If we could go, we have a legal document that's been prepared by Cambridge, Singapore University, Harvard attorneys. It's ready, almost ready. We're going to be launching a campaign called We Can't Plant Ice. That's why the Arctic is so important. We can restore forests, we can restore wetlands, we can restore mangroves. Once the ice is gone, even geoengineering won't work because ice needs ice. You have to have the basis there. You can't put ice in warm water and expect it to survive. And of course, here is one of the problems also with a sea route, commercial shipping route across the North Pole. These polar bears are, a friend of mine was on this ship, and you can't see, but there's a little baby one in the back, and they're running from this ship. Now on the right is the black line is actually the Central Arctic Ocean. And the sea ice, this is old, this is 2021, I believe. You can see where the sea ice is retreating into the Central Arctic Ocean. Now it's retreating even more, and that little star is the North Pole. And again, this is a global commons. This belongs to you. It belongs to you. And indigenous, I've had the opportunity to spend time with some of the indigenous people in the Arctic, and they are really struggling. And it's not just only food and having a difficult time hunting, etc., is because everything has changed. One of our young women who is part of our organization, who is lives in the northern part of Greenland, and she is Inuit, and she said, my grandmother can't tell me the stories now that she used to because all the timetables have shifted. And so it's affecting their spirituality, it's impacting their culture. There's a high rate of suicide among young indigenous. Next. I think
that's it from a slide perspective, and I know Kishla wants to add a couple of things on the indigenous as well. You took the question right out of my mouth.
Thank you, Sally. So just to give you sort of how many people does this impact? So there are 4 million people that live in the Arctic. 400,000 of them are indigenous people. And so I always say they live with the land where we live on the land. And so why does this matter? Let's take a look at Alaska. So Russia, Alaska, Canada, Greenland have the highest population of indigenous people. In our own Alaska, what's happening is the western coast of Alaska has severe erosion. And why does that matter? It matters because these tribes, these indigenous Alaska natives, are losing their land, their way of life, their culture, their spiritual connection to the land, as well as their food sources, their occupation. Everything is changing. And so the last administration spent a great deal of time and money to try to help them move. But just put yourself in their, shoes. And think about suddenly somebody told you you had to leave, you had to go find a new job, another way of life. You need to find another grocery store, except they live with the land, and so their food sources are changing as well. Their caribou is migrating to other places. There's a significant amount of salmon that has died off because of the high temperatures. So that brings it home to all of us, but there are other examples of that in the Arctic with the other indigenous tribes.
Thank you, Kishla. So we do want to get to Q&A soon. I technically have 2 more questions. And this one hits home for me because I come from the tech world. I used to work for Salesforce, for DocuSign, and I see how corporations can use their platforms to plant trees. But when it comes to some of these bigger topics, geopolitical topics, land topics, what is it that corporations can actually do? Can they do anything?
I'll start. So I think first and foremost, considering our current environment, I would say that first, corporations and organizations can fill gaps that are being left due to a lack of federal government funding. So whether that is research, whether that is tech research, science, or as individuals, every day creating a culture that promotes environmental stewardship.
Sherri?
Well, I agree with all of that. It's the transition in technology from in the federal government from the Cold War. When I started working, we talked about technology spinning out from defense R&D. Think of the GPS and the internet. These were all innovations that came out of defense and spun into the commercial world. Now it's the other way around. Now commercial tech spins into defense, and there's vastly more R&D happening in the commercial and private sector. So I would say to all of you who are here in tech or in the private sector, you are going to be leading, whether we're talking national security, economics, trade, or development, the next generation of clean energy that's going to power remote villages in the region, as well as our forces when they deploy remotely. That's all going to happen in the private sector and spin into national security. So I'd say there's ever more opportunities, and I know people with backgrounds like myself are walking around the exhibit halls looking at the next generation of drones and AI, and it's all, it's a new day.
From our point of view, the moratorium actually is a benefit multiplier. And so, because it addresses some of those threats that Sherri brought up, and it provides a platform for multilateral collaboration. And so what corporations can do in this process with the moratorium, they can endorse that legal document that I showed on that was shown on another slide. There is a pledge by an organization called Oceans North that companies can sign. Nike has signed it, actually, that they will not ship their goods across the North Pole. They'll find a different route. We have a petition, We Can't Plant Ice petition, which is available on our website, that anybody, anywhere on the planet can sign, and this will go to, it's a letter to world leaders asking that the ice crisis in the Central Arctic Ocean, given its importance, go to the top of the global agenda. And then there are a series of other, pushing for less, or for more emission cuts. Corporations can have a real voice in that, but they have to show up, and they have to speak up, and they have to stand up. But they can have a real voice. And then there's all these others on the bottom about renewable energy, reduce waste, efficiency, et cetera, that can be done with facilities and corporate headquarters, et cetera, and also in their products, but also influence others in your particular sector to do the same.
We need a sort of like a E Corp, if you will, a little Arctic badge. You know, you're not shipping your goods across the ocean, the Arctic Ocean. You're not using minerals from the Arctic, or, you know, using deep sea mining, derived items. So yes, we are going to open it up to questions here. And yeah, let's just take the first one.
You talk about, I look at the way our world is, we're not going to do anything, you know, with the climate stuff. And I look at some, and with the scenario that really makes me nervous is the whole idea of like the methane bomb thing. You know, I mean, we look at all these holes showing up in the permafrost in northern Siberia and Alaska, the permafrost melting. You know, I mean, like, is there a chance that something, I mean, like, where we could just have some, like, the methane bomb is this idea that, you know, all of a sudden there's a chain reaction, you know, with the methane, it gets a little bit hot, a little bit, and it all goes. Is that something to even worry about that if we don't do anything, these kind of scenarios?
No, you bring up a very good point. So in the permafrost is a high amount of methane that is just as caustic and dangerous as the other greenhouse gases.
It's like 20 times the number.
Yeah, exactly. And so what you're referring to are these sinkholes that are happening across the Arctic, and if they happen under the water, you will start seeing almost like bubbling. They call them methane lakes.
Yep.
And then the sinkholes, you will see sort of a gaseous substance within the sinkholes. And how that is synergistic with anything else is really unknown at this point. They've been happening quite a bit, but as the permafrost thaws, it is a accelerant for the climate cycle. So the more the permafrost thaws, the more methane that's released, the more greenhouse gases, it accelerates that whole process.
So you don't think it could be like something where like it could reach a point and then in like a couple of months it's just done? Like the planet is uninhabitable.
No,
it's not like that, yeah.
No, mainly the infrastructure. So permafrost, like you take Alaska, 80% of Alaska was built on permafrost. And so as that thaws, think about the roads, access, buildings, homes that are now exposed and unstable due to the permafrost thawing.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
My question is about what the U.S.'s influence is in the Arctic and how it's changing. Thank you for sharing photos of the devastating impacts of climate change. I think as a member of the American public, I fear that American politics are changing faster than the climate in the Arctic, and that by our own standards, we may be that negative sphere of influence. And so I'm just curious if you could comment on what exactly has been America's sphere of influence and how is that changing under the current administration?
Well, I would say for decades, really since the end of World War II, the U.S. has seen itself as a global leader, and the institutions it's built have been to preserve a safe and secure liberal world order, from NATO to the International Monetary Fund to the World Bank. And in the Arctic in particular, you could think of the Arctic Council as that example of a treaty-based organization that works to maintain cooperation and secure the peace. Many of those institutions are being undone today, right in the matter of weeks and months. It's almost to me like history is accelerating right now before our eyes. And whether we can continue to be that stabilizing force around the world or will want to be is really uncertain at this point. I haven't given up all hope. I don't want to give up hope because, as a daughter of Holocaust refugees, I know from a bad place in the world that life can get better. My parents were fortunate to escape Nazi Germany when they were very young. So I'm hopeful that we will still have a chance to maintain American leadership, and I think it's important to do that in the Arctic to ensure stability for both our security, our climate, our science, and our planet.
Thank you. George.
Wow. So first, thank you all for being. 33 years ago, two guys sat down with me. We created a little Technology for Good conference called South by. And so thank you. I'm now at UNESCO for the last 8 years as one of your 1,500 ocean ambassadors. I am some days in 9 ocean conferences a day for the last 8 years. You have just been exposed to one of the best things I've ever seen. You badass ladies simplified a very complex hugely important. It's in our top 10 things that we're working on. This issue that was here in this. So follow these ladies religiously and share with every ocean, every oxygen breather you know. My father was a weatherman in World War II in Greenland, putting up the first weather radars. And you know why? He was in Korea and Vietnam too, and then he was, after 22 years there, he was 6 years NOAA director. I have climate here. This is absolutely something we've got to get a hold of, and I'm sorry to report until everybody's ready to take their foot off the gas pedal. I'm going to tell you, I've, in the last few years, figured out the thing that everybody can do now is composting. Everybody that eats food can compost. That may be the way we can get this 40-year backlog down, to drop the heat, to save the ice, blah, 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 blah. But anyway, hands to our volunteers and hands to everybody for being here. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Founder of South by Southwest, just saying.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you, ladies. My name is Camilo Barcenas. I'm the co-founder and CEO of an outdoor health app created by wilderness medicine doctors that provides offline wilderness education resources. It provides offline visual and medical guides, and we are consistently developing, identifying data APIs for weather and translating them to risks for humans. We're here because we got nominated for an innovation award. So thank you for making this. Thank you everyone for being here. I have a question because you all are clearly the smartest at the edge to ask the question as our current institution is dismantling our resources. Can you all point to, does the European Union, are there other publicly available data sources that will not be compromised in the years ahead for us to keep track and educate and empower ourselves with? The app is called Goes Health.
Well, I'm going to answer or approach this question in a little bit of different fashion. So I think not just a dismantling, but removing our country from key agreements, such as the Paris Agreement, such as the World Health Organization, so I'll talk through that health biosecurity lens. This is all about cooperation, and so right now we're in such a new arena where we have organizations within our own borders that are not allowed to share data, and data allows policymakers and decision makers to make informed decisions. And so there is one site, it's called arcticportal.org. It is about as close to a central repository for policies, for maps, and one of the ideas is to create a central data repository. Obviously, there are challenges with that, considering the geopolitical tensions, but those are conversations that are already starting to happen so that we can appreciate what's happening in the Arctic as a whole and not just in our respective nation.
Also, I would suggest go to the National Snow and Ice Data Center. And also, you've probably all seen in the news that NOAA, the National Oceanographic, so that is being neutered, basically. And in that process, they're taking down a lot of climate data, even recent data, and that to me is of a huge, huge concern because they are involved in weather. They make more accurate weather forecasts and projections than anybody else, and that can save lives. And they also track by satellite what is happening with so many pieces of climate change on the planet. I went in the other night and I was looking for some data and it said this is no longer available. Sorry for the inconvenience. So that is going to be a potential challenge for those of us who rely on really good science.
We have to, sorry, the volunteers need to cut it short, but the speakers will be around, so please come and chat with them. Can we just give a round for these incredible experts? Thank you so much.